feminist collective which as it agitates for gender justice and Caribbean liberation through a strong anti-colonial sensibility. We are committed to different arrangements of being human that depart from heteronormativity, and we embrace Jamaica Kincaid's imperative of having a demanding relationship to history. Intersect was founded in 2015 by myself and Eneka Nicholas at a time when we were both physically in Antigua and conducted in-person teach-ins and workshops with students from the Antigua State College, the Antigua Girls High School, the Clear Hall Secondary School, and the Antigua Grammar School, and so on. Under the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean program, the Equality Fund Catalyze Grant, and the Black Feminist Fund, we are continuing our call to feminist political education at a time when funding streams have come under threat by authoritarian governments around the world, including the United States. We invite you to delve into our website, intersectantigua.com. Lucia will share the link in the chat. And this is a website where we have curated approximately 200 essays, stories, poems, art, and photography across a range of themes from our Caribbean Feminist Stories project. We also have an artist in residence program. We recently hosted Joanne C. Hillhouse from Antigua and Barbuda, and we're currently hosting Dr. Jacinth Brown Howard from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So as you participate and leave this session, I'd like to encourage you to write and submit any essays or stories that you have about Caribbean feminisms and revolution to submissions at antigua.com. I know that Amilcar Sanatan will be encouraging and inspiring you to do so. So joining us from the Intersect team is our resident artist, Lucia Murray. Lucia, please introduce yourself before we go to Amilcar.
All right, thank you so much, Sarah. So, hey everyone, I'm Lucia, also known as Lem. I'm intersex resident artist as well as a freelance visual artist and writer. I'm responsible for a lot of the graphics that you see, and in addition to providing support to Sarah in bringing these programs to life. I'm really grateful to be in this space with you guys today, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much. I love Lucia. Lucia is a lifesaver, and Lucia's art is incredibly beautiful. Her graphic design, incredible, spectacular. So, Lucia, please accept your flowers. So, moving right along, Amilcar Peter Sanatan is an interdisciplinary Caribbean artist, educator, and activist. He is from Trinidad and Tobago and currently works in Helsinki, Finland. His public leadership and research amplify the youth gender equality nexus of development, decolonial urbanism, and literary publics in social change. He promotes co-imagining and co-creating and the co-creation of development in the Caribbean and Americas region. Sanatan is the recipient of several professional and social leadership awards for his service to under-resourced communities in the region. He promotes democratic, sustainable, and grounded approaches to national, regional, and global development. Sanatan co-edited 2 special issues in academic journals on Caribbean gender and cultural studies. He holds a BSc psychology and MPhil interdisciplinary studies in gender studies from the University of the West Indies. He is a PhD student in cultural studies in the same institution. So Amilcar Sanatan's chapter, Masculinism, Gendered Power Relations, and the Caribbean Left, is an incisive and urgent reflection that denaturalizes the gendered iconographies of Caribbean leftist political organization. From Forbes Burnham to Maurice Bishop to Janet Jagan to Beverly Manley, Amilcar underscores the value of feminist historiography to address the fissures in historical narratives about the Grenada Revolution and revolutionary projects writ large. His reflections are germane to our contemporary political moment at a time when so many governments around the world are devolving into fascist politics. Please join me in welcoming Amilcar Sanatan with a virtual round of applause. And again, I encourage you to turn your cameras on. Amilcar, welcome, welcome, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you very much, Lem. Thank you very much, Intersect. And it's a pleasure to be here. Intersect is an organization I rate for years now, and definitely one of the not just progressive, but really committed to a regional integration movement. It could have been Antigua and Barbuda, but it preferred to be Eastern Caribbean. It could have been Eastern Caribbean, and it preferred to be Caribbean. It could have been Caribbean, and it went Commonwealth, diasporas, majority world, and that is amazing. And it wasn't an act of solidarity. It was the natural linkages to political struggles that people like Sarah and others have seen and done in the work. So it's a blessing to be here and to support some conversations. I know that some of you all are on the morning side of things, some of you all on the evening side of things, but I will try to keep my chat up because I have some questions to get some feedback, and I think that would be great for me to understand the way things roll, you know. So let me put on the slideshow. All right, you see me? Great. Now I have this thing where I really have limited capacity to do the full screen and navigate the rest of my life. So you will see the master tab, but there's not any impediment, I think, to what I have to communicate. So the first photograph I want to share with everyone is an interesting photograph, and I would like to provide context to it afterwards. This is La Miliciana de Guazualito, and it's part of the Caribbean and the Americas. But maybe in the chat, and you could feel free to put on your audio to say what resonates with this photograph. Why does this photograph move in a revolutionary moment around the world? Why does this take up steam? Why does this attract so many responses and becomes critical to the propaganda of a particular political organization on the left? So I'll be interested in learning a bit like from what you see and those connections we could make. And this is decades after. Anyone? By training, I'm supposed to wait 24 seconds with the silence and then people supposed to answer. So I just doing that. Patrice said because babies must always be fed. Babies must always be fed. That's an interesting point. We could go a little bit further with that as well. Anyone else? Any observations of this in this photo?
Sorry. I just wanted to say something really quickly. You could call me Alex, just quick, just to keep things quick. But something I've noticed is that like a lot of countries in the region have really strong feelings about breastfeeding, particularly those that are quite like right-winged Christian. Breastfeeding should not be done in public, or if it must be done, it must be done underneath a cover. So I think it's really, in my opinion, kind of revolutionary to see somebody breastfeeding in public happily without a cover, without people like, pointing or mocking or, shunning her.
That's very interesting. Very interesting observation. And of course, we see how in our contemporary environment, certain policing of women's bodies and breastfeeding, albeit Caribbean governments as early as the 1960s and 70s took a non-aligned movement position, really, or a third world position at the time, which was to support breastfeeding as the policy for public health, as a critique of corporatized versions of like the milk and so on, and getting involved with healthcare. So part of it was skepticism. Another part was in the interest of not trying to get profit on a birthing process for women, what we thought was in our interest at the time. So breastfeeding is like a whole PhD if somebody wants to explore the way that breastfeeding happens in policy. Breastfeeding happens around gender norms and the exposure and the breast and women, of course, and lactating women and disabilities in society, which means impediments to it. So it's quite interesting. You took a very contemporary question on this photograph here. So thank you. In the chat, I see Jessica Lewis. It addresses women's bodies, politicized, scrutinized, breastfeeding in public. Patrice, again, no matter what they are doing, the demands of motherhood call, women are expected to answer. Very interesting. It's contrary to the colonial law, women's bodies should be confined to the private by Luz Marina and colonial and patriarchal, and that is where we will hold. So, I mean, I know this photograph as La Miliciana de Guazualito, which means the militia woman from Guazualito, and this is in Nicaragua. I found out today on the internet through Google, her name is Bianca Lopez Hernandez. I don't want to leave her nameless after all these decades, but that her name is Bianca. And it's a photograph that I even had in my household. The Sandinistas would use this photograph to mobilize women's participation in revolution. And therefore, our conversation today is going to look at three axes: women and revolution, women in revolutions, and women's revolutions. We could see those three things happening, and they might be their alignments, and they sometimes diverge. So women as a social group in a revolutionary project and movement, women and revolutions, how is that revolutionary government or political apparatus constructing the way they understand womanhood and femininity? And then women and revolutions, how are women themselves imagining, theorizing, taking up certain actions to advance a movement? Alexandria Alexori said they finally noticed the gun on their back. That's an AK. So this is a political construction. She said she's smiling actually because the rain was falling, so her hair was wet. And she's like, taking this photograph of me, you know. She's breastfeeding during a rally. She has the AK on her back, and we are communicating that the revolutionary woman is politically active. The revolutionary woman is outside of the household and involved with revolutionary militant struggle. But the revolutionary woman does not absolve herself of the burden of motherhood and child rearing because she could carry those responsibilities at the same time. So this is a construction of the revolutionary ideal for a woman in Nicaragua, which gives us an aesthetic archive to look at, to begin to see some of the complexities in which womanhood in an emancipatory project is they're going to emancipate women in some ways, but they're going to be contained and confined in others. So as you said, Patrice, she's made to carry responsibilities at the same time. This is nothing new for women, as we know, in terms of the patriarchal expectations of them. But it's an interesting photograph, even to have her smiling. Even to have her smiling, that there is joy, that there is pleasure, that there is duty she is producing to the state, but also reproducing the revolutionary project through mothering of a child. She's continuing the revolution in her way. And that again shows the significance of women's reproductive function in the production of state power and so on. So that's why I love this photograph. Now we take that to Grenada now. We go to Grenada, and I always love this photograph. You know, I was like, why revolutionaries smile and hug each other so much? There's this seriousness and kind of militancy, but in this language of solidarity and fraternal relations, and it is a boys' club. there is discursive room happening post-independence, post-Black power, in a revolutionary process where men, dominant men, could be affectionate to other dominant men. But it's also Anglophone cultures contending with South American cultures. The masculinity is now translating. Fidel Castro hugs you. Fidel Castro is well above 6 feet. He's a bear of a man. But in Latin America, one does not question one's sexuality for hugging at that time. In some cultures, men hold hands. The Russians, some other people, not the Russians, sorry, but in France, they would kiss each other. In Morocco, they might do that. So you have a lot of cultures of masculinities that is circulating in this language of fraternal ties and solidarities. And this idea of the new man is a man who in some way is liberated from a colonial suit, liberated from the strictures of a white male patriarchal ideal, but is being accommodated in other ways, right? He's going to continue certain things, he's going to expand on others. And I always, I think, look back because this is Michael Manley, Daniel Ortega, Maurice Bishop in Grenada on a state visit here, and the army men, the men in the Cariba suit or bush jacket, or what we call guayaberas. But they laugh, they smile. It's a form of intimacy we are seeing between men. But again, the backdrop of it are guns, the state and military power. And at all times, as we see in this next photograph, sexual desire is also projected on these new male icons. All leaders have to be cute to make it, generally. And if you're not cute before you was in power, people started finding you look a little bit more attractive when you have positions. But like any space, leadership, the halo effect works. There's a social psychology to it. People are perceived, are seeing more desirable, having the values that people want. But there is a sexual politics at play in the 1970s. So women's cleavage is going to feature in the aesthetic of a revolutionary woman. That the growing of the afro as compared to that razored hairstyle that we have for colonial subjectivities, the boy that they drew in the back of school books. And of course, this photograph is quite interesting because all revolutionary vanguards are surrounded by men in particular. They have to protect their leader. These are the security personnel around the leader. But this older woman, and she affectionately touching Maurice because the recognition of his beauty as well. Michael Manley, of course, enjoyed that, where people spoke of his beauty. And what we begin to see now at this time is the issue of gender and sexualities in our face all the time. But for some reason, scholarship is not interested in these questions. It's there, you know, these are the photographs from that time. But what they saw was a charismatic leader and his people. But we in 2025 could look back on the archive and see the construction of desire, heteronormative relations, male complementarity to women. What is appropriate for women? What is appropriate for men? What are the ideals for children? This is at play during the Grenada Revolution. And yes, Che Guevara is definitely sexualized, but he was, I think, fairly widely understood as a handsome man. I think by all measures, he would give me an inferiority complex. So we have that. And I want to take up Christian's comment about mentioning intimacy between men in this revolutionary moment in the 70s. Strong masculine identification comes out of so much poetic tributes to fallen leaders of the moment. So many poetic tributes to Walter Rodney, reproducing Rodney as a masculine idol, not just a fallen comrade and leader. And of course, that is at play because, as Che Guevara says, we are in the process of constructing a new man. And the new man needs to be embodied because all revolutions are myth-making projects as well. All projects, political projects, are fiction. It's going to construct its heroes, its ideals, their patrons. It's going to sanction and punish. And these are the figures who are coming forward. And it is also for people like Maurice Bishop, through this desire, he is a university-trained, educated lawyer who is from the petty bourgeois class. His father is a businessman. This is also a domain in which they make connections to the working class. That I may not be of you, but I care about you. And I could walk among you, and I could be with you with the least amount of anxiety. So imagine if we were to begin thinking about politics as not just the political party, not just the decree, the laws, and the legislative agenda. We could do that, and I could have that conversation. But what I wanted to look at very clearly is the lens that we have in our culture to understanding the many frequencies that are happening in our revolutionary moment. And of course, women are going to be conscribed in this project. So, and this doesn't represent all the photographs. We are now looking at women and children. Women are going to play a very important role in the Center for Popular Education because, of course, teaching is for women. But understandably, sometimes women put their hand up first to teach. You ever saw like care work in the family? The man will say how much money he sacrificed and put down, but a woman will always sometimes be ready to risk employment. Somebody will bring out your cousin who just finished CXC to take care of your grandmother. There's this way, and that is in 2025 I'm talking about. Let's go back decades, 1970. These are people living in real time. These are structural inequalities where people still had a belief that after primary school, you should learn to sew and be a homemaker. It's a very different society than we have at this time. You also have less educational infrastructure. You have a limited post-secondary education. One of the first things the revolution is going to do is try to expand access to sixth form studies in Grenada. Looking back on that, that might sound archaic, but this is almost late 20th century. A revolutionary government comes into power to think about how do we carry people in school beyond the age of 16. So these are concrete realities that women are living, and education is seen as this vehicle to advance the interests of women. And women play no small role in the revolutionary project. While it was given less status in terms of they understood their achievements, they understood their engagement. If it is we acknowledge Bishop for the level of consciousness raising and leaders of the the New Jewel movement, for the levels of political consciousness raising, and this is not to shade his charisma, which he clearly had. But if we could acknowledge the role of political education, why is it we cannot naturally acknowledge how women who led the Center for Popular Education and the teaching that was happening on a large mass-based scale as being critical to the lifeblood of this revolution? And this is why our frame matters. And what I try to probe is to not just counter a discourse in life. I sometimes try to work through it, with it, in order to transcend it. Sometimes we see that the archive is male-dominated, so we start to explore women's voices, necessarily so. But sometimes I like to just go and discuss the man then. Let me look at that man, let me talk to him and deconstruct their views. Because to truly understand relations of power, we must begin to explore the subordinate and the superordinate. How long will we only think of marginality as a group and a subject position? But it is in fact relational. It is a power relation. Are privileged people studied? Do we understand how the machinations and mechanics of patriarchy works? How racism works? How colonial subjectivities work? So these are the explorations. I think Nicole Phillip begins, Rhoda Weddock earlier on perfects. And then scholars for over a period of 20 years have been trying to take up, like myself and others. And so we go to the Grenada Revolution again. And we begin to see, we started with Miliciana de Guazualito. And in the Grenada, they are constructing women in the revolutionary vanguard as well. Women in militias. And now we see a student in school uniform holding a rifle. This is absurd to me. This is absurd. By my appreciation for nomenclature and the rights of the child, I would not support this type of mobilization. I understand the context in which it took place. But even when national service happened in Guyana, there weren't only fears, but there were reports of child abuse and sexual abuse during those youth camps and military base style training. So even when we see images like this, are there questions that we have today with our growing and expanding sense of rights that we could take stock on, not only for women and men and masculinity and femininity, but girls and boys and children? But it also puts into focus, when I see these images, the mind space of the state. They are under this current state of emergency because of imperial aggression. The threat of invasion, which was real and happened, always loomed over the work. Caribbean economies already have limited fiscal space and policy space to advance the economic and social well-being of countries. Imagine if there was a political closure on that as well. In line with what Sarah was speaking to, the geopolitical context in which we are living in is a form of political closure, where we have political parties in the Caribbean talking about they're against woke culture, talking about the containment of rights they never gave 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but they doubled down on what rights they will not offer to vulnerable groups. In Trinidad and Tobago, we saw the ascension of a woman prime minister, a woman president, and a woman opposition leader. And the Minister of Gender Affairs and Child Affairs does not exist in position anymore. And I am not trying to chastise any one woman in this system and culture for not advancing women's rights. But we also know that just because you look like me or have a similar background to me doesn't mean you advance me. Politics is politics. And that is why we want to get into this language of multi-systems oppression, because it is all connected. And I'm not fighting for the name of a ministry. I'm fighting for the priority of a state. And these things are in flux more and more. And certainly, as Christian said, Shilini Puri, I have it here, her work has been critical of that militarization. And that militarization was not even passive. It was also a containment of press freedom. Even Rastafari were under attack because they were seen as trafficking and cultivating marijuana, which at that time was stigmatized. So in revolutions, like any other political movement, groups have claims and power is contested continually. So in terms of the learning objectives today, we were trying to explore, to what extent do you ground your political analysis and movement building with lessons learned in Caribbean social history? I'm an activist, so I'm speaking to you in that capacity. Now that we've learned from history, is that a cue for us to begin to think about when we read scholarship? Does it just teach us facts? Or could it make us feel what is happening in that moment? And I will show you that form of reading is an activist reading I'm making of Philip. Philip is really a descriptive article, and I'm not saying that to say is less than analytical. She's describing because she's doing the excavation work to show women's role in the revolution, which is grossly understudied at that time. But could we read that with the lens on what can we do now when we see that article? What is at stake? What is possible? The next question is, what is the significance of understanding intersecting systems of oppression for gender justice? What is the significance of understanding intersecting systems of oppression for gender justice? And then, in your experience, discuss an example of understanding and mobilizing around combating intersecting systems of oppression, which is very difficult, by the way. Single issue is the best part. It's easy. One more use study table. Women farmers and climate change. Give them a workshop. That is straightforward. But when we deal with intersecting systems of oppression, guess what happens? We have contradictions in the culture and in the polity that we have to live out. And I would provide some insights about my experiences with that. And I would love to hear from you. Claro. So one of the first experiences I would have had was when I was the coordinator of the UWI Socialist Student Conference, would be, how do we create conversations on what is perceived as radical political literature, but radical meaning questioning structures, you know? But when people say radical, they always give it a hard time. So I tried not to give myself a hard time. But when we were looking at left political histories, I found little room on my campus to have that conversation. You almost feel strange to imagine a better world. And I met up with the Grenada Students Association and I said to the president, I said, yo, I want to have a Maurice Bishop lecture annually. I don't know how long to last. When we graduated, might die. But we could start having a conversation. I don't care if 5 people there or 50 people there. We need to have a conversation and we could make it thematic. So it's not just about Maurice Bishop. We are a new generation of people coming after to talk to people who in the revolution then, ask them questions and to understand what we could do to improve our society. And in the second Maurice Bishop lecture, we had Merle Hodge, Dr. Merle Hodge, a great writer of literature in the Caribbean. Merle Hodge's story is quite amazing. Merle Hodge, she has a PhD in French literature. She's this young academic. She's teaching, I believe, in the secondary school system, and she get a phone call. The Grenada Revolution is a very Caribbean revolution. The Attorney General is not going to be a Grenadian. It's going to be from Jamaica in the Revolutionary Project. The speechwriter for Maurice Bishop at that time was Ralph Gonsalves. Brian Meeks plays a role from Jamaica. So there's a Vincentian Jamaicans playing a role in the newspaper at the time. So, and progressive groups throughout the region sent delegates to even work in the revolution to support the project. Merle Hodge is from Trinidad and Tobago, as with many others who went, they got the call. And it wasn't for more money. It was to manifest. Manifestar. Manifester. That dream that we had of our revolution. The Grenada Revolution, make no mistake, is the highest political expression of the Black Power Revolution happening in the Caribbean at that time. The Black Power Revolution we could take from the Sir George Williams affair, 1968 student riots, protests, the Rodney riots on campus at UWI Mona. You have 1970 as another high point in Trinidad and Tobago. It's interacting with other places. 1979 is the Grenada Revolution, the highest political expression of Black power in the Caribbean there. And the successful revolutionary project in the Anglophone Caribbean for the 20th century. So Mulhaj goes to work in the Center for Popular Education, but Mulhaj is also a feminist. Mulhaj cares about children. Mulhaj has questions. Mulhaj says, you know, I always found it interesting. The comrades meeting all hours in the night, and they expect women to make sandwiches to feed them after the meeting. They expect women to put the tablecloth out when they have to talk. And now they're meeting the gender division of labor in this political project. And they were not shy about their criticism and critique and recommendations. But it just shows us it's not an easy road for people. And I thought that was something to learn from. It was easy to look back on a revolution to say what it did or what it didn't do. But you have to understand even empathy from some of its members who could have a critical view, who could make recommendations, who saw the larger picture of a revolution, but was still critical. Mulhaj is one of those figures. And I needed to go to what we call a Tanti Mill to begin to ask what is possible for us. While we were at that meeting, a group of comrades who were Marxist-Leninists from that time too, they were like, all this gender thing, all of these other issues. I believe in human emancipation. That revolutions were about human emancipation, and all these other issues were like subcategories of analysis if we were in a truly revolutionary project. But that wasn't true. The question we asked, does the man on the street menstruate? Does John the public get pregnant? Having gender responsive revolutionary movements are important. And when we take the positives of the revolution, coming out of the revolution, what they started to do was establish maternity leave. They attacked by law quid pro quo, which is sexual favors for advancement, even though that was still pervasive in the culture. Then we'll get to that subsequently. They elevated some women into leadership. But looking back now, when they are often celebrated for putting women in leadership, the political norms in the CARICOM at that time had more women in leadership. They were not doing something exceptional. They spoke about it like that. But the norms in other non-revolutionary governments were doing it. So what the revolution did was, rather than move the needle, it really went into the times that was happening in the political culture in the Caribbean at the time. So looking back, we get to have certain conversations that really help us to move ahead today. And one of the things that the younger women comrades in the Socialist Student Conference, you know what they were critical of? At that time, blogs were huge. This is 2015, 2016. We still read blogs. When I tell people read our blog, it's like I ask them to read a newspaper now. Like they vex. Everybody want the podcasts when they're sweeping and mopping. Nobody want to read it, you know what I mean? But at that time, blogs, you know, in my view, was interesting because it allowed a lot of people, especially young women in the feminist movement, to engage in a vocabulary which we weren't reading in the newspaper, which sometimes our scholarship in Caribbean studies in the region was not speaking to. And the blogs allowed us to engage. People started to talk about misogyny. You know, there were a lot of conversations that were being driven. I think that is where even the language of rape culture, I don't know which scholars were talking about rape culture as that term and driving it and popularizing it. Blogs were, cyber feminism was part of that movement. What Intersect came through, you know, that 2010, post-2010s period is a wave. And I could mark it, but that is not the conversation of today's, even though we could do a critique of waves, but it is a wave. It is a social media post-independent because Barbados going to have this period of independent life and legends going to come about. Womantra has this thing in Trinidad and Tobago where Womantra. Intersect is going to pop up. You're going to have Tamarind Army. And digital platforms going to play an important role even in the regional consciousness that is being produced here. This is not a small moment. This is a watershed moment. And you could look at all leaders between 28 and 38 right now in the Caribbean would have been formed by the 2010s to 2016. You could see that where they are now. And the question they were asking is, when we would go online, we don't find Caribbean leaders all the time. Who were the radical women in the region that we could just read a blog on? Who were the radical women that we could just get their profile on and talk about? And yes, we have the orgy lords and other people who have been studied. But Professor Rhoda Reddock wrote about Elma Francois, but there's a book. Who fast forwarding that work here? And that is how, oops. Hey. We started to think about names. Sorry, I don't have the slide. About the Phyllis Squads, even though we had a very critical view of her. The Deputy Minister for Women's Affairs, President of the National Women's Organization, of course, wife of Bernard Cord. But we had Claudette Pitt, the Deputy Minister for Community Development. We had Jacqueline Creft. Actually, we wrote a paper in History and Action on Jacqueline Creft and raised consciousness about Jacqueline Creft because we felt we identified a lot with her vision, and she was the Minister of Education, Youth and Social Affairs. We saw videos, we went online and found it of Decima Williams, the Grenada representative to the Organization of American States. So we're beginning to look for figures from our history, our landscape, who could inspire us to act. And that is where my love for it, and it's also what was happening too. The feminist movement definitely was ascendant. We wanted to ask, where were the socialist feminists, you know? Not all feminists agree on everything. We have different approaches. And it's not my place to comment on the distinctions and what is legitimate or not. But I identified with socialist feminists. I was raised in a third world feminist environment. The scholars who taught me were formed by that. And I was happy to be in community with people who saw socialist feminism as the vehicle through which we were critiquing and challenging capitalist patriarchy. So let's go into the review of Nicole Phillip. By chance, did anyone get the chance to read these articles that went out? Mine is the less important one. So the Nicole Phillip is the principal one. I could always speak about mine by chance. There's no problem. Even if it didn't, I will still float some of the topics in it. So Nicole Phillip provides a critical overview of women's participation, leadership, and experiences in the Grenada Revolution from 1979 to 1983. And Phillip discusses the structure of the National Women's Organization. The NWO was established by key women in the People's Revolutionary Government and quickly became part of the state apparatus. It was the official organ for women's participation in Grenada's political life. Now, the NWO was a forerunner to the establishment of the Women's Desk in the state. Now, that is not small. For decades after, we are going to look at the formation of what we call gender bureau. And for those who understand French, a bureau is a big fancy word for a desk. So the Women's Desk and the Gender Bureau, which we still refer to it often as today, is the way the state has now established an instrument for the mainstreaming of gender in the state. It's not small. It's important. And today we refer to it in a very strange term called the gender machinery. We talk about the gender machinery of the state. Now the NWO, so for those who are studying, by the way, the Grenada Revolution, and if you don't want to study the revolution alone, you might have an interest in understanding gender statecraft. How does the state produce or articulate relations of gender and power in the society? The reason we're talking about activist student life, we're looking at personalities, looking at the state, is because the Caribbean, many of us, not all of us, but many of us live on islands. And when we don't live on islands, we live on very big countries that have more trees than people. You realize all activists who don't come to the conclusion very quickly would realize that if you went to 5 to 10 schools, depending on the size of your country, you would probably be in class with a member of parliament or a minister in government by the time you reach 35 to 40. That if you ask people, or if you attended a church, mosque, or a temple, you are probably once removed from a major decision maker in your country. Caribbean countries are very small. And that's why politics is sometimes very possible and also very hard to come by, because it's your cousin who's going to call you to tell you what to do and what not to do. The state is not that far from your everyday life. The state is the principal economic actor in your country. Most social opportunities are afforded by the state. We have very small private sector environments. We have a strong nationalist culture, which sees the ruling political party as the main driver of development. People have deep relationships to the state. While they might have disdain for them, the dominance of the two-party system in the post-independent period shows the repeating legitimacy of the state through force as well, but it is there. So it's important for us to get into the state, get into civil society, get in trade unions, get into the groups. Those are strategies, and the National Women's Organization spoke about it. And don't think government is something you shouldn't be in as well. If you are interested in politics, run. If you want to learn more things about it, then get mentored and join a network so you won't rely on patriarchal networks to move up. That the Caribbean is yours. You know, Jacquemin said, Gouverneur de la Rose, we are the masters of the dew. L'homme est le boulanger de sa vie. Man is the baker of life. Well, where's woman? Femme, la femme est le boulanger de sa vie. The woman is the baker of her life, de sa vie. Her life. You could lead anywhere you want to lead, and understand, even in a revolution, you'll have constraints as a woman. So, everything is fair game to me. Back to the slides. So the NWO, which is the National Women's Organization, effectively platform women in civic leadership positions in trade unions, cooperatives, that would have been agricultural cooperatives at that time, and community-based groups. Yet the top-down approaches by those women in it, they were pressured a lot by the Central Committee, which were led by men. But they were also top-down, the National Women's Organization and Phyllis Scott. And it was like a form of political elitism. And what the NW did also, which we must think about, and in terms of activists, it contracted the civic space for women's organizing in Grenada at the time, because they had an ideological understanding of women's organizing, and they were like the official apparatus for the state. They kind of fight down other groups that didn't identify them ideologically. And to be honest, it's important to recognize that all women, while they may not share your politics around social class and so on, women's organizations generally all work to kind of enhance the well-being and the rights of women, you know? And we have to work out our contradictions in a way that doesn't denigrate one or the other or remove players out, even though we have very different views. You know, it's I don't know how it is, and I would love to hear from the participants here as women organizing, where you know you're consciously resisting a patriarchal culture, but the fissures and contradictions of social class and ethnocultural understandings, you know, that kind of way is a political opponent, but they don't want to give way or give room to lose terrain to patriarchy. It's very difficult. I would love to hear how you all think about that. Anyone? And what Nicole Phillip article does is kind of clear the ground for new questions that I will take up in the masculinism chapter, where I ask, how was masculinity constructed in revolutionary Grenada? Does the new revolutionary man in the new revolutionary state emancipate or contain women? What are the entanglements? And to effectively understand power and its intersection with identities is important to understand, as I said, the subordinate and the superordinate. So I want to acknowledge some key readings here quickly. I could actually close this. If you want to think about the work of the Grenada Revolution, and I will share this with Sarah and the team, Lem. Rhoda Reddock, 1985, she has a book chapter called The Popular Movement and Mass Organization, the case of the National Women's Organization of Grenada, 1979 to 1983. That chapter illustrates the importance of analysis of social movements contemporaneously. I don't think there's any other published piece by a scholar on the revolution as early as that, looking at the question of women in the revolution. So it's an excellent article to read. It's actually the thing you have to read before you kind of go forward. And she has the most radical critique of the project, by the way, and I'll get to that after. Nicole Phillip in 2010 wrote a book called Women in Grenadian History from 1789 to 1983. Wendy Grenard in 2011 wrote the book chapter Jacqueline Creft and the Grenadian Radicalism in Women in Caribbean Politics. Wendy Grenard also edited a collection in 2016 called The Grenada Revolution, Reflections and Lessons. There's an interesting one. This is not really a gender-conscious book, but it is Regina Dumas, a Trinidadian, Trinbagonian, who goes to the revolution and is involved with agricultural production and the company and supporting the government program. And it's a memoir of a cocoa farmer's daughter. There's a chapter where she talks about her experience and family and fears when the invasion happened, which is quite interesting. I, with colleagues Shalini Bahadur and Reagan Gibbons, would have done for whatever with Jacqueline Creft, The Paradox of Women's Liberation and Caribbean Revolutionary Left. That's an article. Laurie Lambert has a brilliant book, which is interdisciplinary, which looks at literature and, of course, what was done in social science, but using literature to fill the gaps in Comrade Sister Caribbean Feminist Revisions of the Grenada Revolution, as in 2020. And then he would say, like, I helped write up the book chapter in 2024 that we shared out today. So there remains a lot of room for scholarly, creative, and activist political attention on the Grenada Revolution and other liberation movements in the Caribbean, especially when we look at like gender, sexuality, and class. One of the key insights, I just want to start to get to what Nicole was talking about, Nicole Phillip, is the idea of privilege. Nicole Phillips says something really interesting. The St. George's Progressive Women's Association, because many of the leaders came from the middle class and were professional and educated, they were less victimized by Eric Gary's government, which was the prime minister that was overthrown by Bishop's government. And I found that really interesting as like a acknowledgement that we have different positionalities in the movement, you know, as women, as men, as which bodies could be violated by the state as compared to others. And that is something we could always keep in our mind sometimes. I find quite interesting. Then we look at tendencies of centralism in the NWO. So centralism is this dominant strain for the left in managing political culture. In fact, the left would create this boogeyman of Trotskyite thinking, you know, is this very strict sometimes and reductive Marxist-Leninist approach to organizing. But the National Women's Organization, in their desire to be mass-based and well-organized, reproduce some of the harms that came through the centralist tendencies that they were also experiencing in the New Jewel movement and the People's Revolutionary Government. So that is quite interesting when we think about how are our structures gender just? Are our structures democratic and empowering to women, even though by me named a women's organization? And that would be the same for groups of Black and brown people, indigenous people. It would be the same for young people. In one of the challenges in the youth movement, it was to be serious, we became more hierarchical and structured to be taken seriously by the people we were resisting. It was an interesting dynamic because if we were counter to the dominant norms, we were given less attention, respect, and status. And some groups rather be complicit with hierarchy and top-down relations, which actually oppressed us, than to produce other modalities and ways of being that we could have organized. So I found that that was a reflection that I had from the article. Of course, Nicole Phillips is not, Nicole Phillips, what my name? Yeah, Nicole Phillips is not discussing that, but that's one takeaway. Let's look at the politics of basic needs. I found this was very interesting. Is sometimes we read the past and basic needs look obvious, which is one of the things the National Women's Organization did was organizing on the efficient and fair distribution of free milk. In Peru, Mariana Elena Moyano talk about Vaso de Leche, the glass of milk program. That's a radical program that they were doing in the barrios, in the pueblos jóvenes, sorry, in Peru, to make sure children they were trying to redressing those nutritional deficits that they had. So for us, when we think in our feminist organizations today, in our youth-based organizations today, in our rural movement and urban youth group movements today, how are we redressing basic needs? What is our movement dealing with around food prices and access to quality food? The National Women's Organization had a home improvement program. They were going by women and helping repair their homes with volunteers. The National Women's Organization had public health engagement. Because we, as activists, need to mobilize people to take advantage of services. So the state has inadequate, for example, in the Caribbean today, state has inadequate mental health resources, but it is also highly underutilized in the ways it could be done sometimes. I'm talking about men, because of certain social attitudes and gender beliefs. How are the gender equality organizations or male allies and comrades who are in the effort working to mobilize men to access quality mental health care? It's not healthcare only serving women. What are men doing to mobilize men to have positive health-seeking behaviors? These are basic needs. Environmental custodianship in communities was important to keep the community clean. At that time, we didn't have the language of climate justice, but cleaning up the community was an important part of the Grenada Revolution. They had nationwide cleaning programs because to take care of the environment was a way of service to your country. Another thing I want to talk about is the promotion of education of women and girls. Do not let any higher education statistic fool you about what is happening with boys and girls in school. So basic literacy was seen as necessary for employment, but also their political consciousness, my friends. 1/3 of boys fail English A, our compulsory English exam, every year since 2020. And not too far behind, we have girls failing, around 20%. You cannot have 1/5 of your boys, 1/3 of your boys and 1/5 of your girls failing exams for compulsory subjects. And don't let me start to talk about mathematics. And if you don't have English A and mathematics, you don't have a full CXC certificate. And when you don't have that, you're going to be turning every page in a newspaper because you could only command a certain salary in this economy. And for all the talk and the rhetoric governments have had in the Caribbean and good institutional arrangements have been made, I want to acknowledge that. But the economy has not change the status of what doing a trade is from compared to those who do formal education. I reject the approach by every government today that says academics clearly doesn't bring the results. Young people work with their hands, especially boys, because boys are in crisis. And now we push technical and vocational education because we underperform in school. That is a relinquishing of the role of the state in improving educational outcomes for our youth. You don't do trades because you fail school. You explore technical and vocational education because that is aligned with your goals or your competence and your interests. Why is it we pushing that? Because we're not trying to fix the illiteracy and innumeracy in our society today. And that is why we are very much back in a time where we have a literate part of our public and an innumerate and illiterate part of our public. And we just create a gender war to misdirect resources rather than saying, what could we do to help children who are routinely failing English and mathematics at age 16? And this is why when we bring up the issue of social class, because what happens when you fail? You're going to stay at a certain strata in society. It prohibits most forms of mobility. We need to be involved with basic needs, whether we live it or not. We also need to continue lobbying, as the NWO did, for women's participation in trade unions, agricultural cooperatives, and community groups. All right, I'm conscious of time. I see Harper LaRue. When you brought up cyber-feminism, I thought of the woman that this wave of feminism leaves behind. Women without access to digital world remind me of the women stuck in poverty who didn't benefit a significant material way during the revolution compared to the women of higher economic status and higher education. That was powerful, Harper. I'll give you a concrete example. Find your mentor and hold on to them. Now, mind you, you ever have like a relative you didn't know they were important until you got older? So like Auntie Merle is like a figure in my life since I'm a child. And then when I went outside, I was like, she's like all this thing. I was like Dr. Hodge, and it was kind of crazy to see her like that, you know. I know this as this loving lady and since I was a child, and she always misnaming me, you know. But what was interesting about her, she did something that I loved. Corporal punishment is outlawed in Trinidad and Tobago by 2001, I believe. And Merle Hodge with the Women for Progress, I can't remember the name, working women in East Trinidad. Working women would go around and working women would do mobilization around Trinidad and Tobago around stop beating your children. You know, most people disagree with you when you go into a community to tell them not to beat their child. And that is the activism that inspired me when I was young. When you would lose, when the only gain is, and when you meet a group of 10, could you move the needle to like 2 more people want to stop beating their child? You'll never get 9 out of 10 or 7 out of 10. Sarah, acknowledge the messages sent, not just talking without reading it, yeah. So I see that is important because they had to go into communities and deal with their views and give them an alternative, knowing that they wouldn't accept it. Because it's not just about they lack education, there are certain cultural beliefs, there are faith-based practices, there are also fears, there are also limited support for educational goals and so on outside of the family. So it's quite interesting, like what we have to take up. So I want to start wrapping up what I'm doing here, and we could explore this in a Q&A, which is that we need to contend with how difficult patriarchal legacies are hard to undo. And what I tried to kind of speak to in my chapter on masculinism in the left was even in the revolutionary government, there's an investment in bourgeois, colonial ideologies, heteronormative ideologies of what men and women should do and be. And that is happening in the midst of emancipatory racial rhetoric to improve the standing of Black women and Black men in Grenada. But there's still a complicity with what a man and woman should be. And there's also a change in laws to address sexual harassment. And while that is an important achievement for the revolutionary government, people getting scholarships to Bulgaria, read Nicole Phillips, and you have to have sex with the person who disbursing resources in the state before you go. So quid pro quo sexual harassment, dealing with what did women put on the agenda to deal with sexual violence? That question was raised as well. So we have work to do always to bring movements together. And that is why when I close, and we could always discuss anything else, I argue for a depatriarchal movement in the Caribbean. As we were decolonial, we have to be depatriarchal. In Bolivia, one of the indigenous movement, when Evo Morales came to power, indigenous movement say, we want a ministry for indigenous people. And the indigenous woman said, what for you all indigenous men to rule my life again? It will be the ministry for indigenous people and depatriarchalization. So it's important for us to think about power that contends with colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchal power, and the intermarry of that in Caribbean political life and addressing it. And if you all want to explore, I could discuss concrete examples of that in my work around latrines in Trinidad and Tobago and what we call latrine eradication. I could discuss complexities of intersectional organizing, and that's why multi-system oppression matters, but trying to end the child marriage laws in Trinidad and Tobago. And more importantly, I would love to hear from you, your experiences, what resonated, what didn't resonate, not just with what I said, with the readings, or maybe just what I said. But I really appreciate everyone's feedback in the thread. It was really interactive. So thank you very much.
Wow, thank you so much, Amilcar. Everybody, please give Amilcar a virtual round of applause. That was so amazing and resonant and powerful. I want to start off our questions. So I have one question and then I'll open it up to everybody. So my question is, what does the importation of intersectionality to the Caribbean region foreclose? What Caribbean feminist frameworks of power should we be more attuned to, even as we use intersectionality to account for axes of power and systems of gendered violence?
Excellent question. So intersectionality as the etymology, the genealogy of that term is being used by Black feminists in the United States to use the law as an instrument to recognize the diversity of subordinated women and marginalized groups, but the intersecting identities primarily of race, gender, and then more class, and then sexuality, and so on. But while it's important to mobilize around that, multi-systems oppressions focus less on that idea I have to be of a group in order to mobilize with a group, not for a group, but with a group. Our identity is not meaning our social identity, which is a category given to us in society, is not the only starting point for work. Liberation, that's why I would admit, it forecloses our ability to move across social categories to do the liberation work. For me, I don't consider myself a male ally. I use male allyship as an accountability mechanism and a form of ethics to relate to the feminist and women's rights movement. But I'm a comrade. And I will fight to defend the life of 10 turtles. I would fight to reject homophobia in all their forms, and I will fight to protect the dignity of children and boys, because I am inspired by feminist politics, and we are all involved with a project of liberation. For some, it is nationalist. For some, it is a philosophy of social justice. For some, it's for the global south, or what was formerly the third world. And sometimes intersectionality focuses a lot on your standpoint and your ability to relate to other categories. Whereas multi-systems oppressions builds momentum for the individual to speak to all systems of power and understanding how it confines people at the same time. Or certainly, there's no hierarchy of oppression by Audre Lorde. But thank you so much. But I mean, even though I said it's some things are foreclosed, it's not bad to be intersectional by any means. That is a brilliant concept that kind of gets it in one word. But it didn't begin what Caribbean people were always doing, what Sri Lankan women were always doing, what Nigerian women were always doing. We were always doing multi-systems oppression work.
Yes, yes, and that's usually the contention that I have. There's a way in which, you know, frameworks from the global north get imported in such a way as to erase the pre-existing work along similar lines of accounting for multiple systems of oppression in the Caribbean region. So thank you so much. Any other questions from the audience? 24 seconds, you said, right, Amilcar? Full time.
Certainly, Harper. Oh, Chalmers. Yeah, I'll go quickly on that. And I want to acknowledge Satira, a colleague from university as well when we were there. And doing work in gender. Kalila, Satira, I believe you work in the energy sector for a while as a woman in it, and you had critical perspectives on the way gender is also organized in that sector, which is quite interesting, which also has an ethnocultural dimension as part of it as well. So you are doing that multi-systems thinking. Christian as well, based in the UK, I believe. Christian is doing contemporary work, revisiting Black Power and that long 70s as he uses in his work at progressive and radical projects and bringing up questions of gender and sexuality along the way, and give a very interesting reference. And you could always feel free, Christian, to share what Andaye said, critiquing revolution. And of course, I read Comrade Sister, big up Laurie Lambert, that said that book is a big bad book, but a different angle. It is a different angle. It's taking a very literary focus and raising questions, which also shows you the possibility of the discipline. But as you could tell, with just my priorities is about the activism and focus on how do political characters move in place and make things possible. Quickly, child marriage in Trinidad and Tobago. Nobody know child marriage is a law basically enabled by law in Trinidad and Tobago for years. Trinbagonians are surprised when the head of the interreligious organization basically says he's not in favor of changing laws to prohibit child marriage. That kick up this bacchanal in this country. Now, it might, if you tell this that Trinbagonian, it sounds normal. When I see this in other parts of the world, it's very surprising. Trinidad and Tobago has a marriage act. It has an Islamic marriage act. It has a Hindu marriage act. It has an Orisha marriage act, right? And why is it this country contending with all these marriage acts? It's because in colonialism, marriage is outlawed. Marriage is prohibited for laboring groups where they're extracting profit from your bodies and labor. So, now hear this contradiction now. Groups struggle as a form of resistance to have the right to be married. The independent state comes about. So there's no Christian marriage act, of course. So the state has a marriage act, which is going on these Christian norms. Other groups becoming legitimate at different periods in history now have their marriage act for their customs, norms, and a form of recognition. 60 years now, we on into independence, we realize the age for marriage for girls in some of those acts, 12 years old, 14 years old, and some people saying this is abhorrent. Guess what happened when we try to change those laws? People feel, is this group of Christians or secularists attacking historically marginalized non-Christian groups. That is part of it. The second thing is the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Church speaks out against it and says we are in favor of changing these laws. Now people look at the Hindus now and say, oh, are you backward? Oh, is all you who keeping these laws on the book to marry children? Muslims, you trying to do that? People think geographically is happening in South. We had to get the data to show where these marriages were being registered. And I did activism at that time with my peers, and we would go around. I thought it was obvious. All my friends, I call the constituency of Twitter with no MP, of course, are against the marriage laws. My colleagues in university, and we would go out in public, and we thought we were raising awareness to kind of build momentum for the movement. And I was shocked how many people supported child marriage because they felt it was the state infringing on their household affairs. Now, when they infringe on it for other vulnerable groups, they don't care. But it didn't like that encroachment of the state. Some people felt it was a form of Judeo-Christian bullying that was happening to groups. And of course, if it is attacking Hindu and Muslim groups, it's a kind of antagonism to Indo-Trinidadians as well. And when the decision was made, when we had meetings with the different women's organizations, we go to the Anglican Mothers Union and we spoke there and they allow us to talk and we're like, we believe the age should be 18. They go to the Catholic group, we believe the age should be 18. The women's NGOs, 18 years old, that is the way it's done. The Hindu Women's Organization, I think it was 15 or 16. I can't remember exactly. And a lot of people victimize the Hindu Women's Organization and Brenda Gopi Singh. Ironically, it was Brenda Gopi Singh who was working with different temples and pundits trying to change their mindset to think about that, but was also lobbying politicians for over a decade to make this a legislative issue. So you see how different groups are contending with different forms of patriarchy within their community. And the state, the history of the state patriarchal ordering of groups, but also of girls, is going to create this kind of entanglement for who is now just, who is right. Almost is a question of modernity. Who could become modern at the right time? And that created a lot of pressure internally in the movement, to the point where when the law was passed to prohibit child marriage, I felt there was no celebration or post-mortem because it was draining on the energy of different groups, because the attacks sometimes turn inward and hostile to people who were seen as not progressing. Of course, I categorically reject all child marriage, but I believe there was a sensitivity required to the way that we built alliances among people, recognizing their social histories and the forms of patriarchy they're contending with. Catholic Church, brown middle-class patriarchy might not be the same as South Trinidad, Indian, Hindu, male patriarchal power. We are contending with patriarchies. And is there room for difference? These are the questions we have to ask as a movement. Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, bedtime, Chris. It's bedtime. Bedtime for me. It's 7:54.
We have I'm not sure if you got to the question by Harper LaRue. Okay.
Harper LaRue. Changing mindsets and attitudes is the best metric of change. Sometimes I actually don't care about mindsets. Martin Luther King said something I love. He said, I know when they passed the Lynching Act, he said, I know a law won't change your heart, but it sure won't get me lynched. Sometimes we need to pass laws that move ahead of majority rule and violence. I don't believe in putting all human rights to this plebiscite where we have to have a referendum on respecting the dignity of people. If we leave that up to the majority, that could be very harmful to a vulnerable group who don't have the political arithmetic to protect their dignity and rights. So that is why changing mindsets, of course, is our long political work. The goal is political education. That is what we are doing fundamentally to transform minds, the imagination. But at the same time, we need to be quick on making sure we put protections in the law and also economic livelihoods. In this environment, it is sometimes strategic to ensure people have economic autonomy to make choices, and women in particular, their economic autonomy. In fact, the Latin American feminist movement, autonomia, is looking at economic autonomy, social autonomy, political autonomy, and bodily autonomy. Those are the dimensions of autonomy that they're taking up because empowerment could be very vacuous and co-opted by the state in terms of what is understood as women's empowerment.
That's great. That's amazing. Thank you so much. I know that people are getting tired, and I do have one final question to wrap us up. If you have to leave, that's fine. This is being recorded, so you will be able to hear the response afterward when we share the link to the recording. So the final question that I have as we close is, so even as we denaturalize the masculinism of revolution, and perhaps also woman as a category also needs to be held up to scrutiny for its cisnormativity. Is the revolutionary figure needed for revolutionary political organization? We think about revolutions and all, the Maurice bishops and so on, and the women invoked in your essay. What are some of the pitfalls of needing to have this revolutionary figure? Is it needed in our contemporary moment?
I'm supposed to say no, it's not needed, but I like it. I love how individuals create publics. I think it's beautiful, especially when it is caring, loving, and gentle. What if we had leaders who could leaders formed by social work, volunteerism, care for the elderly, the sick, the vulnerable, constructing publics? What would that look like? What would that influence people to do? So for me, it's a multiplicity of characters. I don't believe in a what we call one-manism at the time, or one leader where we all have to subscribe to. That creates too much followers. And I don't like the idea of necessarily followers and leaders, but I perpetually support leaders creating publics. Publics are important, and unlike institutions, individuals create publics. That is why people go to Bernie Sanders' rally, even though he's not a president. That is why people go out, and political parties have to create figures who could attract a crowd because they won't show up if you are unable to create publics. But I would love to reimagine what does that public mean for us and the way that we relate to each other politically and have knowledge sharing. I would love that. But leaders are important. That leaders are people who make often a unique sacrifice. And the last point I would say is, when I was in the Global Student Forum in Brussels, my colleagues there did something that was very transformative for me. We didn't have positions on the committee. We had portfolios of responsibility. So we understood that your role could change anytime, and that you are called to do a role and define that role at a particular time. So we weren't in a position. It was a portfolio of responsibility. It was an alternative way for me to understand leadership.
Yeah,
And yes, we end up named after them, like me and my big brother Fidel and my younger brother Marcus Garvey.
Oh my God. That's a really interesting response, because I'm thinking about, the absence of these figures and leaders, and
yeah, it's feel lonely.
and also, like, the work needs to be done even in their absence, right? And so,
Yeah.
I just hope it doesn't become a crutch where, we'll only do the mobilization and the revolutionary political activism when we have this figure to rally around? And how can we get that work done in the absence of those figures?
But you are a figure, eh? And that is why, for me, leadership is diffuse. You are a civic leader, very political in character. You know, I running you down for over 10 years, asking, hey, Intersect doing this. Could I get a blurb here? Could I put this in here? For me, leadership is expansive, and the Caribbean will be in a very good place when primary school teachers become leaders, guidance counselors become our public leaders. We have a lot of people who care and love people every day, and having a political culture around them will be, I think, great.
Yeah.
Like yourself and others here, I'm sure.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you once again for this incredible teaching. Lucia, I'm going to turn it over to you to deliver our gratitude reflection.
All right, sure. So, on behalf of Team Intersect, I'd like to thank our facilitator, Amilcar Sanatan, for leading such an illuminating and varied discussion related to women in revolution, women in revolution, and women's revolution, the aesthetics and manifestations of masculinity, masculinism, and patriarchy on the Caribbean left, hierarchies, and even the status of children in revolutionary movements. I'd like to thank our co-founder, Sarah, for organizing today's session. And finally, I'd like to thank our incredible participants for joining us in co-creating a generative space where we can interrogate the aesthetics of revolution and delve into the gender dynamics and unequal power relations at play within revolutionary movements. I hope that we leave this discussion today thinking about the ways we can mobilize to build a better world, navigate our movements critically, and adopt new modalities of organizing and being in community with one another. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And thank you again, Amilcar. This was a really great discussion. I really loved it so much.
Thank you, thank you.
Amilcar, I'm inviting you to stay on so that as the folks leave the room, I'd love to take a photo, a screenshot, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to start putting folks in the waiting room, but thank you so much for joining us.